America, 1920. The echoes of war had finally faded across the Atlantic. The trenches of Europe were quiet, but the streets of America were just beginning to boil. It was a year of transformation, of smoke-filled factories rising into steel skies, of Model T Fords rattling down cobblestone alleys, and of jazz spilling from smoky clubs in New Orleans all the way up to Harlem. America stood on the edge of a new era, one of wealth, excess, and freedom. The Roaring Twenties promised liberation. Flappers danced in sequins, telephones connected homes like never before, and the stock market soared. But beneath the glittering surface of this golden age, something far more sinister took root. In dimly lit back rooms, whispered deals were made over whiskey and cigars. Gangsters, once petty thieves lurking in alleyways, began to see opportunity where others saw chaos. And at the heart of that chaos, a single piece of legislation that would change everything. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution officially took effect. Alcohol, America's favorite vice, was now illegal. Politicians hailed it as a moral crusade, a noble effort by temperance advocates to purify society. Churches rang their bells, mothers cheered. But behind closed doors, bootleggers grinned, because what they knew, and what Washington refused to understand, was that banning alcohol didn't stop people from wanting it. If anything, it made them want it more. Prohibition wasn't just a law. It was an invitation. An open door to corruption, violence, and empire building under the cover of darkness. And the men who walked through that door, they came not from boardrooms or country estates. They came from the slums of Sicily, Naples, Calabria, hungry, hardened, and ready to build a kingdom out of chaos. The Empire of Shadows. These weren't your average thugs. They were immigrants, many from Sicily, Naples, and Calabria, who came to America with nothing but hunger in their bellies and fire in their souls. They arrived speaking broken English, dressed in threadbare coats, and carrying dreams too big for the steerage decks of immigrant ships. They found no welcome mat in the land of opportunity. Instead, they were met with prejudice, poverty, and the cold indifference of a nation that saw them as outsiders. But in the shadows of the cities, in the tenements of Brooklyn, the docks of Chicago, the alleys of Little Italy, they carved out a life for themselves. Before Prohibition, these men scraped together a living through petty crime, protection rackets, gambling rings, loan sharking. They were small-time operators in a crowded criminal marketplace. But when the Volstead Act slammed the door shut on legal alcohol, it opened a vault for those willing to break the law. Bootlegging became the most profitable black market enterprise in American history, and the Mafia. They organized it like a Fortune 500 company. No longer just street-level gangsters, they became distributors, wholesalers, and retailers of America's most coveted commodity. They smuggled Canadian whiskey across the Detroit River, brewed beer in hidden basements, and ran rum from the Caribbean through Florida ports. Their operations grew so vast that they needed infrastructure. Warehouses, trucks, bribes, and muscle. They created supply chains that stretched from coast to coast, protected by layers of secrecy, loyalty, and fear. And with every case of liquor sold illegally, their power grew. The rise of the kingmakers. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in Chicago, where a young Italian-American named Alphonse Gabriel Capone rose from obscurity to become the most feared man in America. Born in Brooklyn in 1899 to poor Neapolitan immigrants, Al Capone started his career under the tutelage of Johnny Torrio, a savvy gangster who taught him the value of discipline, diplomacy, and deadly force. By the time he moved to Chicago, Capone was already hardened by violence, ready to take over the city's South Side operations. But it wasn't until Prohibition that Capone truly came into his own. He controlled hundreds of speakeasies, breweries, and distilleries. He bribed politicians, judges, and police chiefs. His network stretched from Detroit to Miami, and his influence reached deep into the pockets of America's elite. To the public, he was a paradox, a killer who donated turkeys to the poor, a monster who smiled for photographers. To his enemies, he was a butcher. To his rivals, he was a king. And on February 14, 1929, he sent a message that would echo through history. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 men lined up against a wall in a garage on Clark Street and executed in cold blood was not just a hit, it was a declaration of war. Capone had eliminated the competition, and in doing so, he cemented his place as the undisputed boss of bosses. But even Capone could not escape the long arm of the law forever. Though bullets couldn't bring him down, paperwork could. In 1931, he was finally convicted. Not for murder, but for tax evasion. Still, by then, the damage, or rather the foundation, was already laid. The Mafia had proven it could operate like a business. And businesses, once established, are hard to kill. The birth of the 5 families while Capone ruled Chicago. Another revolution was brewing on the East Coast. In New York City, the beating heart of organized crime. Here the Mafia evolved from loose gangs into structured families. 5 dominant groups emerged, each with its own territory, rules, and code of honor. These were the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese families. The foundation of modern American organized crime. At the center of this transformation stood Charles Lucky Luciano, a visionary unlike any mobster before him. Luciano wasn't interested in short-term gains or reckless violence. He wanted power, yes, but also order. He envisioned a national syndicate, a corporation of crime that could operate across state lines without internal wars tearing it apart. He allied with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, forming what became known as the National Crime Syndicate, a coalition that brought structure to chaos, profit to paranoia, and legitimacy to the illegitimate. Under Luciano's leadership, the Mafia stopped being just a collection of violent ethnic gangs. It became a business, complete with boards of directors, meetings, and contracts. It controlled unions, piers, trucking routes, and nightclubs. It owned politicians, newspapers, and even sports teams. It wasn't just crime anymore, it was infrastructure. And at the heart of it all was a word spoken only in whispers, the sacred code of silence. Luciano understood that loyalty and secrecy were the Mafia's greatest weapons. Betrayal meant death. Silence meant survival. And yet, even within this tightly controlled world, power struggles were inevitable. The Castellamarese War of 1929-1931 was one such battle, a brutal conflict between 2 factions vying for control of New York's underworld. At its center were Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, both claiming to be the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. It ended with the assassination of both men, orchestrated by Lucky Luciano himself. With their deaths, Luciano reshaped the Mafia into a council-based system, the Commission, ensuring that future disputes would be settled around a table rather than in the streets. But peace, in the world of organized crime, is always temporary. Over the decades, the Mafia would evolve again and again, expanding into narcotics, labor racketeering, and even Hollywood. It infiltrated construction, restaurants, and financial institutions. It whispered in the ears of senators and shook hands with celebrities. And all the while, it remained invisible, wrapped in layers of secrecy, loyalty, and fear. The language of violence, violence became the currency of power. Assassinations were not random acts of rage. They were calculated messages. Betrayal meant death. Disrespect meant war. Every hit was a lesson. Every execution, a warning. The Mafia spoke in blood, and those who ignored its language rarely lived to regret it. In Chicago, Capone's war with the North Side Irish gang led by George Bugs Moran culminated in the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a chilling display of precision and brutality that shocked the nation. In New York, the Castellamarese War turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds. Entire blocks were locked down as rival crews fought for dominance. Bodies were found in rivers and garbage dumps, in abandoned lots, often with signs of torture. Yet, despite the carnage, the public fascination only grew. Newspapers covered mob hits like sporting events. Gossip columns debated who betrayed whom. Some saw the Mafia as villains, others as anti-heroes, enforcing order where the government failed. Speakeasies continued to thrive, run by men who answered to no law but their own. Politicians looked the other way in exchange for campaign donations. Police officers pocketed envelopes stuffed with cash. Judges signed rulings in return for favors. Corruption spread like wildfire, and the flames were fueled by alcohol. Aftermath. When Prohibition ended but the empire stayed by 1933, Prohibition was repealed with the passage of the 21st Amendment. Americans could legally drink again. But the damage, or perhaps the opportunity, had already been done. The Mafia was no longer just a group of bootleggers. It had become a permanent fixture in the American underworld. Bootlegging had been the training ground. Now came the real empire. Gambling dens flourished in places like Las Vegas and Havana. Drug trafficking grew with the influx of opium from Asia and heroin from Europe. Labor unions were infiltrated, extorted, and controlled, and the FBI? For decades it refused to believe the Mafia even existed. J. Edgar Hoover denied its presence in America until well into the 1950s. Meanwhile, the five families continued to grow richer, more powerful, and more elusive. Even after the infamous Appalachian meeting in 1957, where dozens of mobsters were caught red-handed, the Mafia adapted, learned, and survived. Trials followed. Informants came forward. Laws were passed. But the roots of the Mafia had gone too deep. Legacy in the shadows today, the Mafia may not rule the streets like it once did, but its legacy remains. In movies, books, and documentaries, its myths live on. Names like Capone, Luciano, Gotti, and Gambino are still whispered with equal parts awe and dread. Its fingerprints can still be found in politics, entertainment, and finance. Its language continues to shield secrets from the light. Prohibition was meant to save America from itself. Instead, it created monsters. Monsters who thrived in the dark, who fed off chaos, and who built empires on the bones of laws designed to destroy them. And in the end, they didn't just survive Prohibition. They rose from it, and they never looked back.